I walked along a dirt trail within the dense forest, my boots crunching on the leaves and twigs. Sunlight was fading as evening approached, casting long shadows through the towering trees. The patrol had been uneventful so far, just another routine day in the woods. And then I spotted him. An unconscious hiker lay in a heap beside the trail, his face pallid and covered in sweat. There was a gash on his temple where he'd struck his head during whatever accident had befallen him. He looked to be in his 20s or early 30s with an average build and an unremarkable face that made it difficult to remember specific features later when I tried to recall them. "Hey, bud," I said as I knelt beside him, checking for responsiveness. "Can you hear me?" No response came from him, not even a twitch of movement or change of expression. My eyes flicked back up to take in the surroundings again. There was no sign of any blood, other than what was coming from this guy's head wound. No broken branches or trampled underbrush either. Just this one spot where he lay motionless on the ground. I tried again to wake him up by shaking his shoulder gently, but still got no response. "Looks like we're going to have to move you," I said aloud, more for my own benefit than anything else. "Hang tight." I lifted up my radio and pressed down on its side button with one finger until it beeped softly at me twice. It meant that nobody would be able to reach me by radio while it was set like this, but it also meant nobody would hear what happened if something went wrong. "Ranger Mike calling Ranger Station, come in." "Over." Silence greeted me after several seconds passed without any reply from headquarters at our home base miles away through these dense woods. It was not uncommon to lose radio contact in these parts, but it still made me uneasy. "Ranger Mike calling Ranger Station." "Do you read me?" "Over." Again there was no reply. I sighed and pressed the button again, this time holding it down for a few seconds until I heard a beep and then a voice on the other end of the line. "Mike, that you?" "Yeah, it's me. We got an injured hiker out here. Looks like he's been unconscious for at least 10 minutes. I'm gonna have to move him." "Copy that," came my supervisor's voice over the radio. "Just be careful with his neck. Don't want to risk any spinal injuries." I released the button on my radio and placed it back on my belt where it belonged before reaching into my backpack for our first aid kit. The hiker stirred slightly as I applied pressure to a wound on his leg with a sterile bandage from inside the kit, wrapping another one around his head injury as well. He groaned softly as he began to regain consciousness, eyelids fluttering open slowly like drapes being pulled back by unseen hands. "What happened?" he mumbled groggily, looking up at me with bleary eyes while still lying flat on his back in the dirt beside the trail. "Who are you?" "I'm Ranger Mike," I said calmly but firmly. "You're going to be okay now, just relax." He tried to sit up, but I pushed him gently back down onto the ground again, using one hand against his chest, while applying pressure with gauze from inside our first aid kit using my other hand. "You hit your head pretty hard there," I said quietly, after seeing that he wasn't going to resist if I told him what had happened, instead of asking questions about who he was or where we were right away. "Can you remember anything about what happened?" He shook his head slowly, wincing as the motion caused him pain. "No, I don't remember anything. The last thing I can recall is getting out of my car at the parking lot and then—" His voice trailed off as he looked around in confusion, taking in his surroundings for the first time. "Where am I?" "We're in the forest," I said simply. "You were on a hiking trail when you got hurt. Can you tell me your name?" "Eli," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "I'm Eli." "All right, Eli. Let's get you up on your feet and we'll start heading back to the ranger station where it's safe." I offered him some water from my canteen and he drank it slowly, sipping it first but then more quickly once he realized how thirsty he was. After a minute or two of drinking from it with my help, his eyes seemed to focus more clearly and he began to look less disoriented. "You ready?" I asked him finally, after giving him a few minutes to rest while drinking water. "We're gonna have to move." He nodded slowly and allowed me to lift him into a sitting position, using both of my arms wrapped around his torso beneath his armpits for support. "Okay, just take it easy," I told him as we stood up together. "Don't try doing too much too fast. You've still got some pretty bad injuries there." He tried walking forward, but stumbled almost immediately upon putting weight on one leg. It was clear that if not for me, holding onto him tightly with one arm around his waist, like this guy was going to fall flat on his face again within moments if left unsupervised. "I can walk," Eli insisted stubbornly through gritted teeth while attempting another step forward without any assistance from me this time. The forest around us grew still as the usual evening chorus of birds and animals fell silent. The only sound was the echo of our footsteps in the quiet, punctuating the silence like a metronome ticking off time. I slung Eli's arm around my shoulder and began walking again, moving steadily along the trail. He leaned heavily on me at first, but then tried to stand up straighter after a few minutes, attempting to walk without any help from me once more. As we moved along through the forest, I navigated its twists and turns carefully, mindful not to jostle his injuries too much while trying to make decent time back towards home base. The encroaching darkness of night enveloped us more with each passing moment as we proceeded deeper into this wilderness area. But I knew we were getting closer. I could feel it. And besides, there was something about this place that made it hard for people to stay lost in here for long. Like it was watching you somehow, observing your every move with unseen eyes from behind those towering trees which stretched up towards heaven above us all, like ancient sentinels guarding some invisible boundary between worlds. I shook my head slightly, as if trying to clear away cobwebs, or some other kind of mental fog which had settled over me suddenly out here in these woods where anything might be possible. Under the dim light of the ranger station, I carried him through the wooden door. The station's interior revealed a compact area cluttered with the tools essential for our job, maintenance and surveillance of this wilderness area. Radios for communication were stationed at various points around the room, and maps detailing every nook and cranny of our territory were tacked to walls or spread out on tables. Sarah was in here somewhere, I knew, and Lucas too. My two colleagues would be expecting me back soon with my mysterious package from the woods. Sure enough, Sarah spotted me as I came in through one door from outside. Her hair was tied back today, and she had a focused expression on her face as she looked up from whatever task she'd been working on at that moment. Lucas sat across from her at a desk piled high with papers, incident reports mostly, his eyes glued to a cluster of monitors showing various camera feeds set up throughout the park. "Hey guys," I said as they both looked up expectantly. "Look what I found." I gently lowered him onto a worn cushioned chair stationed near a modest table made of wood, which matched its surroundings perfectly in this rustic cabin-like building we called home during these long days spent patrolling these woods. The hiker blinked repeatedly, adjusting to the artificial light, which seemed harsh compared to nature's own twilight out there, among those towering trees which surrounded us all like ancient sentinels, guarding some invisible boundary between worlds. "Thanks," he said finally after taking me in with his gaze for several moments more than necessary. "I owe you my life." "You're welcome," I replied simply, not knowing how else to respond when someone says something like that to you. It's not often people are faced with such extreme situations where their lives hang by such thin threads. But it happens sometimes out here in these woods, where anything might be possible. I told Sarah and Lucas the events leading up to the hiker's discovery out in the woods. She inspected him with a practiced eye, searching for visible signs of trauma, while Lucas observed from his stance beside a filing cabinet filled with past incident reports. The hiker's voice broke the silence, expressing gratitude once again to me for saving his life. His words came slowly and methodically without the expected inflections of someone recently in distress. The tone was flat and emotionless. "Thank you," he said again in that strange monotone voice which sent shivers down my spine. "I am grateful." Sarah offered to get him some water, which he agreed to with a nod of his head. Yet even that motion seemed stiff and mechanical somehow, like it wasn't part of his normal range of movements. Lucas checked the station's clock on one wall, covered with pinned notices and seasonal forest alerts. Then he moved around, making sure all entrances to this place were secure, locking doors as necessary before returning to sit down at a desk across from Sarah. where they both shared worried glances at each other after observing our new guest for several moments more. I remained close by, monitoring him carefully as I had been doing since making contact out there in those woods earlier today. The four of us sat in the mess area at a simple wooden dining table, which served as the centerpiece of the room. It was topped with steaming plates of food that Sarah had prepared, roast beef and mashed potatoes, with carrots and peas on the side. The odors of cooked vegetables and seasoned meat mingled within the room, an olfactory contrast to the natural woodland scent that usually pervaded this place. I sat at one end of the table, across from our guest who took his seat last. He meticulously placed a cloth napkin on his lap, before picking up his cutlery, a knife and fork in each hand, holding them like they were delicate tools made for precise work. Sarah sat to my left while Lucas took a seat to my right. We all began eating our food at once, cutting into thick slices of meat which were tender and juicy. Eli was silent for several minutes as we ate, but then he began speaking again. "I have done much solo hiking," he said in that same monotone voice I had heard earlier today when we'd first made contact out there in those woods, in many places around world. He continued talking about his experiences hiking alone through challenging terrain, deserts and mountains alike, telling stories about encounters with wild animals, or near-death experiences surviving storms or avalanches. Each tale seemed to encompass some kind of extreme hardship or danger, faced while alone in vast woodlands where it would be easy to disappear forever. As he spoke, I observed him closely, noting how rehearsed this all sounded coming from him now, like it was something he'd practiced many times before saying aloud. Each anecdote fell into a pattern, as if following some kind of script which had been memorized long ago by rote memory, rather than learned through personal experience over time spent outdoors. But what struck me most was how there didn't seem to be any emotional inflection associated with these stories. They were delivered in a tone which was completely flat and uninterested, as if he were reading from a phone book or reciting the ingredients on a box of cereal. I also noticed something else strange about him. He would occasionally fixate on inanimate objects while speaking, like the salt shaker or the water pitcher, staring at them intently for several moments before finally focusing back in on his food again and continuing with his tales of adventure. He never looked at any of us directly, avoiding eye contact entirely throughout dinner except for those few brief seconds when he was looking at objects instead. It struck me as both deliberate and disconcerting how he did that. It made it feel like there was something wrong with him, even more than I'd thought before, although I couldn't put my finger on why exactly that was. Lucas seemed to sense it too, giving me occasional sidelong glances which conveyed an unspoken message. This guy is weird. Sarah watched him closely as well, her green eyes sharp and observant as she took bites from her plate of food. We all ate slowly, not just because we were hungry after our long day of hiking through the forest, but because we wanted to watch this man carefully while he spoke. We wanted to observe his every nuanced movement so we could learn more about who he really was beneath that cold exterior shell. Lucas laid down his cutlery after finishing half his plate of food, resting his hands on either side of it, and leaning forward slightly across the table so he could see our guest better during this part, where things began winding down. Eli's tale started to dwindle off eventually until there was only silence between us all once again. But now the atmosphere had shifted somehow. The room felt colder than before, despite the heat being generated by our little wood-burning stove heater in one corner. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat, attempting to dispel the thickening tension by engaging our guest in a tangential conversation about something unrelated to what he had been talking about earlier. "Did you see any bears while you were out there?" she asked, "or any other wildlife?" He responded with a simple nod of his head but didn't elaborate further. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun, and we all went back to eating our food. Eli's words scrutinized now with every bite he took from his plate. His portions of food were much smaller than ours, and he ate them without evident enjoyment, which only made me feel more suspicious of him as time went on. Once dinner concluded, Sarah rises and gathers the empty dishes. Her soft steps muffle against the floor as she carries them to the sink for cleaning. excuses himself with a nod, and retires to the radio corner of the main room, sliding on headphones to check for any transmissions that require the ranger's attention. I assist in clearing the mess area, straightening out chairs, wiping down the wooden table, and returning unused utensils to their rightful place. The cleanup serves as a mundane reprieve from the day's peculiar developments, yet it does little to distract me from my thoughts about Eli. The guest room door closes with a soft click as Eli retreats inside. The hallway light is switched off, and our ranger station surrenders to the night's stillness. I'm left alone in this main area of our home, away from home, my mind cycling through all that has happened today. His robotic behavior earlier when he'd been talking about his hike, his detached speech, his inexplicable scar. It's probably just exhaustion making me think like this. That's what I told myself at first, but then I start inspecting windows and locks anyway. It's routine measure we always take before going to bed at night out here in bear country. But this time, with a heightened sense of vigilance driven by intuition, a suspicion that something is wrong. Exhaustion weighs heavily on my eyes as I glance at that guest room door one final time before turning off all but one lamp in our living quarters. Then I retreat back into those sleeping quarters we call ours, an undercurrent of unease trailing behind me like an unwelcome shadow. Despite my longing for rest after such a long day, despite feeling like there's nothing more anyone can do tonight except sleep, something tells me this isn't over yet. Not by a long shot. That night I lay on the bed, a thin blanket pulled up to my chest, my eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling where shadows danced from the outside foliage swaying in the night breeze. The room was otherwise dark, the light from the nightstand intentionally left off to encourage sleep that stubbornly refused to come. The clock on the wall, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight creeping through the window blinds, read 2:17 a.m. I took in restless breaths and heard Lucas's gentle, rhythmic snoring as he slept soundly in his bed next to me. A bead of sweat trickled down my temple, and I brushed it away with the back of a hand. Suddenly, a faint noise outside cut through the night's chorus, something out of place which did not belong. It was so quiet and far away that if I hadn't been lying there awake like an insomniac owl with nothing better to do than listen for strange sounds in an empty forest ranger station at 2 o'clock in the morning, then maybe I wouldn't have heard it at all. But hear it I did. A soft scraping or rustling noise, which lasted only for half a second before going silent again. It came from somewhere out there beyond our little building, perhaps behind it, but definitely nearby. I strained my ears listening for any further sound, but none came after that initial disturbance had ended. Yet still my body went rigid, and alarm bells began ringing inside me as if this were some sort of innate response, burned into our DNA over thousands of years spent sleeping under open skies, surrounded by predators who would eat us alive if we let our guard down even once. Seeking clarity, I sat up quickly, too quickly perhaps, causing my head to spin momentarily as blood rushed downward into my legs while simultaneously draining from above my neck. The mattress creaked quietly under me as Lucas continued snoring softly in the adjacent bed, oblivious to my insomnia. I reached for the bedside lamp but stopped myself before flicking it on. Instead, I would utilize the moonlight, which was streaming in through the window blinds, enough to see by if I allowed my eyes a moment to adjust. Stepping out of bed, I approached the window, feeling the coolness of the floor beneath my feet. Peering through a gap between two slats of wood which made up our blinds, I attempted to get a look outside without alerting anyone else who might be awake at this hour as well. Seeing nothing suspicious after a few moments of observation, I pulled up on one side of our blinds and then did so with the other as well, quietly and fluidly. Soon we had an unobscured view out into that nocturnal world beyond our little safe haven. With them fully retracted now, I surveyed that dense tree line once again, searching for something, anything. But there was nothing there that should not have been. The forest stood silent and still, as if holding its breath after exhaling that initial noise earlier, which had woken me from my fitful sleep. Minutes passed, marked only by the sound of Lucas's snoring and our clock ticking away above his headboard, and still there was no cause for alarm or reason for me to have been awoken just now, by whatever it was that had made such a noise outside. With one last reluctant turn from looking out into those woods beyond us, lowering down those blinds once more so they covered up what lay outside, I returned back to my bed, lying back down again in exactly same position under those sheets where I'd previously been trying unsuccessfully to fall asleep. My eyes went back up toward that ceiling once more. Despite feeling relaxed now and ready for sleep after having gotten up and investigated the noise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching us, just beyond the tree line which lay so close to our little wooden building. After a night of restless sleep, I was woken by the sunlight shining through the window. The ranger station stirred silently with the new day's arrival. The sounds of someone getting up and moving around in one of the other rooms were barely audible, along with faint creaks from floorboards as they went to get dressed for another day on duty. The surrounding ambience carried a tension that belied the rising sun's promise of a fresh start. My eyes darted around nervously at first, before I realized there was no cause for alarm or reason for me to have been awoken just now by whatever it was that had made such a noise outside. With one last reluctant turn from looking out into those woods beyond us, lowering down those blinds once more so they covered up what lay outside, I returned back to bed beside John, who continued sleeping soundly throughout all this commotion, as if he were dead to the world. Lying back down again in exactly same position under those sheets where I'd previously been trying unsuccessfully to fall asleep, my eyes went back up toward that ceiling once more. Despite feeling relaxed now and ready for sleep after having gotten up and investigated the noise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching us, just beyond the tree line which lay so close to our little wooden building. Armed with only my flashlight and my sidearm at first light, I decided it would be best if we investigated what had happened during our shift yesterday when we found Eli in those woods. It seemed like whatever had made such an awful sound last night might be connected somehow. Stepping outside into the cool whisper of morning air, which greeted me as soon as I opened up that door leading into nature's embrace once more. It felt good being out there again, after having spent so much time indoors lately doing paperwork and filling out reports about what happened on our last shift. But today would be different. Today, we were going to find out what was really going on out there. And I felt a renewed sense of purpose as I stepped outside, my boots crunching down onto the gravel outside the front door. The birds had begun their daily chorus now, singing their songs of welcome to the new day. But to my ears, their songs carried a note of warning, as if they were trying to tell me something about those woods which lay beyond us. I wandered over to the spot where I'd stood last night when I heard that awful noise. My eyes scanned the ground and the shrubs for tracks or signs of intrusion, anything that might help us figure out what had happened here. But as always, it seemed like this forest kept its secrets well hidden from prying eyes. My hand moved instinctively towards my radio at my hip and pressed down on the button. Heading out to investigate the perimeter, I reported into it, trying not to let any concern or doubt creep into my voice. We'll let you know if we find anything. The forest loomed at the threshold of our station, a vast and unknowable entity all its own. It was hard not feel intimidated by it sometimes, and today was definitely one of those days when it made me feel small and insignificant by comparison. But still, we had our duty, our job which needed doing, and no matter how scared or unsure we might be feeling after last night's events, we couldn't let those emotions get in our way. Stepping onto that trail leading towards where Eli had been found yesterday, the world around me began to seem ever so slightly askew from what I knew before. I walked along the heavily trodden hiking trail, surrounded by towering trees that consumed the sky above. My seasoned gaze swept from ground to the dense growth, the vibrant colors of dawn's light filtering through the branches. I maintained a keen awareness while traversing this familiar terrain, my eyes scanning for anything out of place. The weight of my secure, well-stocked backpack rested against my shoulders as I walked. The rhythmic sound of our footsteps pressing into the moist earth served as our morning soundtrack. Suddenly, a flash of color caught my attention, and I stood transfixed for a brief moment before approaching it with measured steps. An expensive-looking backpack was resting at the base of a pine tree, its green material partly obscured by ferns which had grown up around it. Crouching down beside it, I studied its exterior for any signs of who might have left it here. There were none, just frayed seams and faded colors which spoke to extensive use over many years, gingerly unzipping it with 2 fingers, trying not to disturb its contents more than necessary, in case they provided any clues about their owner or where they had been going when they left this item behind. Peering inside after opening it up all the way, I saw there was an assortment of belongings within that might provide insight into who this hiker was or what their intentions might have been in coming here without them. My trained fingers went through each item methodically and quickly, searching through everything without disturbing or damaging any items found within. The morning light helped me examine each one thoroughly before moving on to another object. A flashlight with fresh batteries still inside, a water bottle filled only halfway, some granola bars still in their wrapper, extra socks and underwear, toilet paper. And then finally something interesting. A folded map from within an inner compartment that had not yet been opened since being left behind by its owner. I carefully extracted it from its hiding place and unfolded it on the forest floor in front of me. Looking down at the map, my eyes darted across its surface, trying to take in as much information as possible before refolding it again. There were trails marked all over this park, some of which I had never even heard of before, despite having worked here for over a decade. But one trail in particular caught my attention. It was marked with an array of odd symbols that were unrecognizable to me, not a part of our standard park system or any familiar map legend. I put the map back into the backpack and continued searching through its contents, hoping to find further evidence or context that might explain who this person was and what they had been doing here. But there was nothing, except for one last item. A photograph encased in a plastic sleeve, protecting it from the elements. I took out the photograph and looked at it closely, holding it up in front of my face so I could examine every detail within. The person's features did not match that of Eli. The hairstyles were different. Their facial structures didn't match either. And then there were other clues which suggested an era long past, clothing styles that didn't exist anymore. My gaze lingered on the photograph for another minute longer than necessary, before finally looking away from it again, feeling like a child caught doing something wrong by their parent. With a sigh, I carefully repacked everything into their proper places within the backpack and stood up again with new resolve settling over me like a second skin. With pack in hand once more, I began walking back towards where we had come from with renewed determination to unravel these threads further. While walking down the trail, I saw Eli in the distance and approached. My boots crunched the gravel underfoot, a sharp counterpoint to the soft murmur of the wind through the leaves. They were loud enough to be heard from a distance, but I didn't want to startle him. Eli stood with back turned to me, looking out over a ridge at something in the distance. But upon hearing my approach, he rotated slowly in place until he was facing me, arms folding across his chest. "Hey," I said as I got closer. "I found this backpack earlier on one of our trails. Is it yours?" He listened as I spoke, but his body language was taut, jawline tense. He looked angry or annoyed about something, maybe even scared. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said when I finished describing it. My brows knit together and formed a visible crease on my forehead as suspicion tightened my features. My eyes narrowed as they observed his reactions intently, not missing the brief flicker of evasion that crossed his face just now. "Are you sure it was near where I found you?" I replied. My voice was level but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice heightened slightly now too. Not quite yelling, but definitely bordering on defensive. "I don't have a backpack." I took an instinctual step back from him then, an unconscious move that came from years of dealing with people like this in all sorts of situations, ranging from benign misunderstandings to dangerous confrontations out here in these woods, where there are no witnesses, except for trees and animals. Who can't testify against anyone if things get ugly between two people alone together out here? My hand rested near the walkie-talkie at my belt automatically. Just another precautionary measure against escalating situations like this one. I took another step back, the heel of my boot grinding a small stone into the dirt path as I did so. All right, take it easy, I said, trying to sound as calm and non-threatening as possible. I'm not accusing you of anything. Maybe it was someone else's backpack and it was there by coincidence, but he didn't seem to believe me or care what I thought anymore. He pivoted on a heel and began walking away from me. I watched his retreating form for a moment before pulling out my compact notebook and flipping to a blank page. With a stubby pencil that was nearly worn down to nothing but an eraser nub, I scribbled some notes about our interaction, documenting his behaviors and expressions for future reference. I stood alone on the path, listening to the sound of his footsteps as they faded into the chorus of the forest. Eli was getting harder and harder to see through the trees, but I could still make out his form in the distance. He was striding quickly now, moving with a sense of purpose and determination that had not been present before. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth, which did little to soothe the unease that had settled in my chest. My fingers itched for my rifle, or at least my sidearm, but I had neither with me, just a canister of bear spray clipped to my belt. Damn it, I muttered under my breath, shaking my head at myself. Eli might be nothing more than an ordinary hiker who'd lost his way, but something about him seemed off. I needed a plan, fast. Retrieving a folded map from my pocket, I unfolded it and studied its contours and trails marked in detail. There were only so many places he could go from here. This part of the park wasn't all that big, and there were only 2 main roads leading outwards from this trailhead. Using a pen, I circled one location on it with deliberate creases before refolding it once again into its original shape. Then I hooked up the walkie-talkie onto my uniform belt, next to where it already hung near one hip, opposite where another canister of bear spray dangled at another clip on its twin holster near my other thigh. Surveying our surroundings with steady eyes beneath furrowed brows, I crouched down by a bush minimizing visibility. I glanced around to make sure nobody was watching, then brought the binoculars to my eyes and looked in the direction he'd gone. There he was, a tiny figure moving through the trees, his red backpack bobbing up and down as he walked. I watched him for a moment longer before lowering the binoculars and securing them back in my pack. It was time to tail him. Moving quickly but quietly between the trees, I began following his trail with care not to step on twigs or branches that would snap beneath me and reveal my presence. The man seemed oblivious to me as he moved further away from where we'd first met, striding with long steps as though on a mission of some kind. I paused after about 10 minutes of following him at a distance which would hopefully be far enough away not to be noticed if he happened to glance back over his shoulder. I stood behind the cover of some thick brush, watching him with my binoculars. He was sitting on a bench outside the ranger station, his attention shifting back and forth between Sarah and Lucas. Sarah had her toolkit out and was carrying out maintenance tasks around the station. She tightened bolts on a weather-worn signpost and then moved on to another repair job. Eli watched as she moved from one task to another, his focus so intense that it made me uncomfortable. I scribbled another note about this peculiar behavior. Eli's attention to detail when observing Sarah's movements seemed almost obsessive. Lucas came into view holding a walkie-talkie in his hand. He spoke into it for a moment before putting it away again. Presumably, he was conducting some kind of routine check around the perimeter. As he walked past Eli, I saw that same sharpness in his eyes, tracking Lucas's every motion as though memorizing them. I looked at my watch and made note of the time again, as well as what I'd just witnessed. 2:45 p.m. Eli watched Lucas closely while he conducts radio check around perimeter. This guy was really starting to give me bad vibes now. Eli abruptly stood up from where he'd been sitting on the bench, arching his back in an exaggerated stretch that took longer than necessary to complete. It seemed like this slow movement was meant to be noticed by someone who might have been looking at him from afar. And sure enough, after stretching for several seconds longer than would have felt natural for most people, he took a few paces around the bench before glancing back towards where they were still working diligently at our tasks around him. He looked like he was enthralled by our routine, as though we were a nature documentary playing out in front of him. I thought about the way he'd been acting at dinner, too. Those odd mannerisms and the strange way of speaking. It all seemed to be adding up to something. But what? I needed to know more about this guy before I could make my next move. I decided to go to the room where he'd slept in the ranger station the night before. I gently closed the door behind me, ensuring it didn't make a sound as it latched. Then I proceeded to the guest room, stepping over the threshold with caution. Inside, I surveyed the room quickly, my eyes immediately drawn to the bed with its tangled sheets. Beside it on the floor lay a discarded pillow, as if tossed aside in a rush. Approaching slowly and carefully, my attention zeroed in on something else, an amber-tinted patch on one of Eli's pillows. It looked like some kind of substance had been smeared there and left behind. I put on a pair of latex gloves kept in my pocket for examining potential evidence. Touching this substance caused me no small amount of trepidation, but curiosity got the better of me. I touched it gingerly with one finger and noted its viscosity, thick and sticky, while at once having a faint luminescence under my flashlight's beam. It was unlike any substance I'd encountered out here before. Retrieving a small plastic evidence bag from my utility belt, using one hand only, so as not to contaminate anything else, I used it to carefully collect some of what was left behind by our mysterious hiker. Scanning around again for more abnormalities or personal items that may have been left behind by Eli, or whatever his real name was, nothing else appeared out of place or too suspicious. Having gathered what little evidence there was available here at this scene so far, I exited back into the hallway outside his room again and closed that door gently as well, so as not to disturb anyone who might be sleeping nearby. The feeling that something wasn't right about this guy grew stronger within me now, like an infection spreading through my mind. And yet, there were no answers about what he might truly be and what he was doing out here in the forest. I went to find Sarah and Lucas in the main room of the ranger station again, eager to share my findings with them. The three of us would need to get to the bottom of this together. I found Sarah and Lucas in the main room of the ranger station gathered around a table with maps and papers strewn about. They were deep in conversation, speaking in hushed voices as I approached. "Hey guys," I said, my voice quiet so as not to disturb their concentration. "I've got some strange news." They looked up at me expectantly. "Eli is acting really weird. I told them he's moving like a robot or something, all stiff and mechanical, and he's talking funny too." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "He's talking like he's reading from a script or something," I said, trying to find the right words to describe it. "His voice is monotone, and there's no emotion behind it at all." Lucas scratched at his stubble thoughtfully as he listened. "He keeps staring at us too," I added after a moment of silence had passed between us all. "Especially you two. It makes me uncomfortable when he looks at you like that." Sarah nodded gravely from where she was standing, with her arms folded across her chest, leaning against the table. "I agree with Mike. That doesn't sound right. You think maybe there was more than just physical trauma, maybe some kind of brain damage or something else. It could be psychological too," she suggested after another long pause had gone by, without any of us saying anything further on the matter. "Or maybe it's something we don't even know about yet, some kind of undiscovered disease or condition." The room grew tense again as we considered this possibility together. An uncomfortable silence, hanging heavy in the air around us for several moments before anyone spoke up again. "All right," I said, standing up from the table. "I'll go back out there first thing in the morning. I need to take another look at that trail and see if I can find any other evidence, maybe even get a better idea of where he came from." Lucas stood upright away from the wall, placing his hands on the surface of the table as if bracing himself for what may come next. It was agreed without further discussion. Sarah pushed away from the table, her movements revealing readiness to support my decision despite the apparent danger. I walked across the room toward a wooden chest, taking out a pair of binoculars and a compass. These I placed on top of one of the maps which were spread out across the table. Sarah reached for a nearby lamp, increasing its light output over top of these items to aid in planning my reconnaissance route. Lucas opened up one of our drawers, pulling out an orange handheld GPS unit and checking its battery life and functionality before handing it to me as well, ensuring I had all necessary equipment for navigation and communication. I mapped out my path on topographical map, laid flat on top of some other papers, which were scattered around haphazardly on our dining room table. The next morning, I stepped cautiously along the familiar dirt trail within the forest. Despite the natural beauty that enveloped me, I carried a feeling of anxiety, which was made heavier by the recent events. The trees stood overhead, their branches forming a tangled web through which only sparse sunlight filtered down to touch the forest floor. I gripped my flashlight in one hand, its beam slicing through the darkness and coming to rest upon the disturbed undergrowth ahead. Approaching with growing unease, my eyes were drawn to a gruesome sight. There, where I had found Eli yesterday afternoon, lay a ravaged carcass of what appeared to be a deer. The twisted remains painted a violent picture, fur matted with blood and entrails spilled onto the dirt below it. Flies were already swarming over top of it. I crouched down next to it and observed my environment for signs of danger or anything out of place. No predatory prints marred this earth like they would if this had been some kind of wildcat's meal, or if it had been left behind by one of our many bears who call these woods home during summer months when food is plentiful. No scent was in the air either. No musk from any kind of animal predator lurking nearby, waiting for me to leave so they could come back and finish their meal at their leisure. This kill was different, silent, unexplained. I continued scanning around us while crouching low near that deer's body as flies landed on me and buzzed around my face annoyingly. The light from my flashlight landed upon something sticky and translucent near that carcass as well. It reminded me very much so what I found in that room Eli slept in when he stayed at our station for the night. I extended a gloved hand and prodded the substance with the corner of an ID tag, noting its unusual consistency. Clipping my flashlight to my belt, I carefully collected a sample of the strange substance using a clear evidence bag. It was as if it was made of saliva or snot, viscous and thick, yet somehow still sticky and adhering to everything it touched. The smell was like rusted metal mixed with ammonia. Feeling the forest's eyes upon me once more, I powered off my flashlight and stood up from where I had been crouching, relying on the sun's glow to navigate through the tree line back toward that dirt trail which led back home. The morning sounds of the forest were muted, birdsong not as loud as usual at this time of day. The silence seemed almost deafening in its intensity. I thumbed up on the safety switch for my holstered sidearm once more, comforted by its presence yet hoping for no need of its use today. With that sample secured, I strung an evidence tag through one belt loop on my pants so it wouldn't be lost or forgotten about, a tangible reminder of last night's discoveries, and then began making our way back toward the ranger station once more. The welcome sight of the ranger station emerged from the trees. My boots made soft thuds on the wooden porch as I approached the door, senses still on high alert. Upon entering, a strange stillness enveloped me. "Sarah? Lucas?" I called out, my voice steady but echoing through that long corridor. "Where are you guys?" There was no response to my question. Only silence greeted me as I continued to make my way through each room and hallway. Sarah was not at her desk when I reached it. Lucas, too, was absent from his station nearby, their chairs left skewed as if vacated quickly by both parties. "Guys," I called out once more in desperation, a sinking feeling gripping my stomach as I continued to search for them throughout our small building. My search led me to our guest room, where we sometimes put up hikers who had gotten lost or injured on one of our trails. The door was wide open when I arrived there, and inside it revealed an empty bed with tangled sheets and a pillow lying abandoned on the floor beside it. A breeze tousled those curtains by that opened window, looking out onto a darkened forest beyond. But there were no sounds coming from outside, except for that creaking wood sound which seemed so loud in this place, where all other noise had ceased completely. I let my gaze linger on that vacant room for just another moment, before tearing myself away from it and continuing forward toward Sarah's office once more. I tightened the grip on the evidence bag in my pocket. I steadied my breaths, clenching and unclenching tense fists as I contemplated the implications of what I discovered out there on that trail. After leaving the ranger station, I walked along the dense forest trail. The crunch of dried leaves underfoot broke the forest's morning stillness. My fingers were wrapped tightly around the handle of my flashlight, though the rising sunlight made its beam a mere formality. Without warning, his figure emerged from behind a wide oak tree, standing obstinately on the path directly in front of me. I halted abruptly, eyes narrowing as I took in his transformed demeanor. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that raised the hairs on the back of my neck, and his stance was confrontational, shoulders squared and fists clenched at his sides. I assessed him for a moment longer, searching for signs of that vulnerability I had seen before. Instead, I found a coldness in his glare, an aggression that seemed foreign to this weary traveler who had been so grateful for my aid only moments ago. My grip on my flashlight loosened slightly as an indication that I desired to defuse rather than escalate this situation. "I'm going to need you to leave," he said quietly through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what you're dealing with here." I opened my mouth to speak, but he cut across me with those words, speaking them with such authority and conviction that it sent chills down my spine. "You've meddled in affairs beyond your comprehension," he accused me harshly, "and now you will suffer for it." Retreating one step back, I gauged our standoff's intensity level and reached tentatively toward where pepper spray was fastened to my utility belt at waist height. My hand remained near it, but did not activate it or draw attention to its presence just yet. Eli sneered at me, then tilted his head oddly like a bird would do when trying to see something better out of one eye. He took an aggressive step forward, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. My heart thumped loudly in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, preparing me for any necessary action that might be needed. With emotions pitched high like they were, I steadied my voice and spoke again, reaching out with words this time in an attempt to anchor him back to rational ground. "Eli, you're not thinking straight," I said. "We can help you. We can get you out of here." He rebuffed my attempts at peaceful dialogue with a dismissive wave of his hand and a chilling laugh that did not fit the human frame he was wearing. "You think you can stop me?" he asked rhetorically, as if speaking to himself more so than me. I watched helplessly as he backed away into the trees, each step deliberate, as if daring me to follow him or try anything further. And then he was gone from sight. I remained still for several long moments after that, watching for any sign of movement or sound, which would indicate his presence nearby once more. But there was nothing except for bird song on the wind and leaves rustling overhead. After another minute had passed without incident, I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My fingers finally released their grip on the unused canister of pepper spray at last. I knew I had to return to the others and report this alarming development, but for a moment longer, I remained standing there, gathering my courage and composure before retracing my steps back to the station. I returned to the ranger station and my eyes darted towards Sarah and then to Lucas. They were standing near the coffee machine talking in hushed whispers. Sarah's stance conveyed irritation, her hands on her hips as she leaned slightly forward towards me. Her green eyes pierced me with a look that said she was not happy. Lucas shuffled uncomfortably on the balls of his feet, shifting the weight from left to right and back again. He looked like he wanted to say something but was holding his tongue. They were acting strange. There was no doubt about it. "What's going on here?" I asked them both, my voice firm with authority. "Mike," Sarah said in a clipped tone of voice, "you need to stop this." "Stop what?" "I'm just doing my job." She fixated me with suspicion, her eyes narrowing as she stared at me. "You're acting like we're all suspects or something." Lucas chimed in from behind us, stepping closer with raised hands as if trying to mediate between Sarah and myself, like we might have done something wrong. "I never said that," I replied defensively. "But you can't deny that there is something strange going on here." Sarah let out an exasperated sigh and took a step closer towards me until we were only inches apart. "That's enough, Mike. Just drop it already." I glanced around at the walls of the ranger station, which felt like they were closing in around us suddenly. Too small for all 3 people inside it now. Suffocatingly so, even though it had seemed spacious earlier when I'd arrived after hiking through miles of dense forest alone for hours. The creases on my forehead deepened as I considered our conflict for a moment longer before speaking up again. I'm not dropping anything until we get to the bottom of this, and I think you 2 know more than you're letting on. Sarah began pacing the floor, arm movements punctuating the air as she spoke. Are you kidding me? You think we're behind this? That's ridiculous. Lucas leaned against the nearest wall, arms looping over his chest as he watched us argue. I stopped in my tracks and looked at them both, considering the conflict for a moment longer, before speaking up again. I don't know who's responsible for this, but I've got a hunch, and when I get a hunch, it always turns out to be right. Sarah leaned in from where she was standing near the back of her chair, her eyebrows knit together with concern. What is it, Mike? Lucas maintained his serious expression but said nothing more, simply absorbing my words like a sponge. After a moment, I decided to share my theory with them. It was far-fetched, but it was the only thing that made any sense to me. There's one other possibility, I said slowly, thinking of the backpack I'd found in the woods. What if Eli isn't human? Sarah and Lucas looked at each other again, exchanging another glance of concern. What do you mean? Sarah asked warily. I picked up the backpack that I found earlier, which was sitting in a corner, and held it out for her to see. This doesn't belong to him. I gestured toward Eli's unconscious form on the bed, and this isn't what he looked like when I found him. She took a step forward and peered into the bag, her eyes widening as she saw what was inside. That's not him, she said with certainty after a moment. Exactly, I replied. So why would this be here if he wasn't? And take a look at this. I showed her the substance from his bedroom, which had also been found at the deer carcass, pointing out how similar they were in color and texture. Sarah shook her head in disbelief and turned away from me, pacing back across the room as she thought about everything we'd seen so far today. That doesn't make any sense, she muttered under her breath before looking back at me again with wide eyes. But if you think that's right, then what should we do? I carried the backpack over to where Sarah stood by one of our central wooden tables. Sarah approached the table, her eyes fixed on the backpack. Lucas stepped in, standing over my shoulder, looking down at it as well. I think we should use it as bait, I said. After gathering the necessary supplies, I stood beside the table, was now covered with makeshift trapping equipment. On the table, there were lengths of robust rope, heavy-duty netting, and tranquilizer darts next to a metal dart gun. I checked the mechanisms of the trap again, ensuring everything was in working order and ready for a swift deployment. Sarah occupied her spot on the far side of the room behind a stack of crates filled with outdoor supplies. From where she stood, she could pull the lever that would release our net trap, her fingers resting lightly on it as if already rehearsing what she would have to do. Her gaze alternated between looking at me and looking at Lucas as he crouched down beside one of our main windows out front. He was hidden from direct view by some stacked boxes, but could still see out into our yard through a small gap between them. In his grip was the dart gun, loaded with an extra strong tranquilizer, capable of subduing even large animals like bears or moose, and he carefully adjusted his aim so that it covered most of our front entrance without revealing his position. I moved in quiet strides around each window and door in turn, checking them all to make sure they were locked up tight against any unexpected entry from outside. My expression was drawn as I went about my work, a crease in my brow reflecting just how serious this situation had become for us all, and how crucial each role would be if we wanted to succeed without anyone getting hurt. Sarah glanced towards me, then over at Lucas, who gave her an affirming nod before adjusting his aim slightly once more. The air within our station felt charged with energy despite its silence, as if it knew what we were planning here tonight and agreed that it needed to be done. Lucas took another look at his watch, then checked a digital clock positioned above our radio console. I moved back to the center of the room, pausing to look at Sarah and Lucas again. It was time for us each to take our places. They nodded back at me in return, both looking ready but also apprehensive about what was going to happen next. I couldn't blame them. This plan had more than a few holes in it, and we were taking a lot of risks tonight. But it was all we could do under the circumstances. And if it worked, then maybe we'd finally get some answers about what was happening here in these woods. The station quieted as we waited, staring towards the door, as if that would make time move faster. The outside world receded into the background until there were only 3 people left on Earth. 3 people who had made up their minds long ago that they would be doing whatever necessary to make sure this thing didn't hurt anyone else, like it had already hurt so many others. The only sounds in our little station were the soft buzzing of lights above us, and occasionally one of us shuffling our boots on the linoleum floor as we got into position, or adjusted ourselves slightly while waiting for something to happen. Each of us fixed our attention on that front door, which seemed like a portal through which all evil things entered into this world. An open invitation for any creature from another realm or dimension who wanted to pay us a visit. Outside, I heard wind picking up again after its lull, sounding much stronger now than before. Even though no storm had been predicted by any weatherman, it blew against our building forcefully now, with gusts strong enough. They shook it slightly from side to side with each blast from Mother Nature's lungs. Leaves rustled outside, and I could hear branches tapping rhythmically against one window pane near where Sarah stood, waiting by her lever. Another innocuous prelude to what would happen next. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching upon the gravel outside. At that moment, Sarah, Lucas, and I all tensed up, our anticipation hanging thick in the air like a fog as we waited for the trap to be sprung. I watched as Eli stepped through the door of the ranger station. He took one step forward into the building and then another, and I saw his eyes flick down to the floor. A moment later, he took one more step forward and activated the pressure plate on the floor in front of him. That was when it happened. The concealed net trap I had set up just inside our entryway sprang into action at once. The ropes which were attached to each corner of it pulled tight with a loud snap, and then I heard Sarah's lever being thrown behind me at her station by her desk, activating another switch which caused it all to happen even faster. The net, previously draped across the ceiling above us, swooped down like an eagle diving for its prey. Eli's initial reaction was one of startled confusion as he looked up to see what was happening. But that quickly morphed into something else entirely, something much worse than confusion or fear. His face contorted with rage, and he let out an animalistic snarl from between his teeth as if he were some kind of wild beast caught in a trap. My eyes widened as I saw his form begin to ripple and contort before my very eyes. His skin seemed to pulsate for a moment before limbs began elongating, reshaping themselves into something grotesque and unfamiliar. And then it revealed itself fully, its true form no longer able to be contained by human flesh alone. Sarah emerged from behind her desk, where she'd been stationed off to my right side, holding a taser gun in her hands, which she'd been hiding out of sight until now. She must have already seen what was happening outside when she looked through our windows after hearing Eli knocking on our door moments earlier. Or perhaps she knew about him all along somehow. It didn't matter now either way. The point was, she had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now it had arrived. Eli, or whatever he was now, strained against the net, his eyes flashing with an unnatural intensity as they locked onto Sarah. She saw me looking at her, and our eyes met in a silent signal. It was time to act. Sarah approached the creature cautiously. Her taser held out in front of her like a gun. I could see her hand shaking slightly, but she kept it steady enough to get close without being attacked by the thing. Lucas appeared from behind one of our desks, where he'd been hiding near the rear exit, and approached Sarah from behind, as if trying to flank their target on either side. One of us on each side would make it harder for him to escape when we made our move. As Sarah got closer, I could see Eli, or whatever he was now, straining against his bonds with all his might. Every muscle in his body rippling with effort, as if he were trying to tear apart steel cables. The creature let out another guttural growl, and then there was a sudden surge of strength from within him that seemed impossible, given how tightly bound he still should have been by my trap. The next thing I knew, There were pieces of shredded net flying through the air around me, narrowly missing my face as they passed me by too quickly for me to react properly. Some kind of rope or string smacked into my cheek, hard enough that I felt blood begin trickling down my face from where it had cut into my flesh beneath one eye. But I ignored it all for now, focusing only on what mattered most, the entity's movement. The fastenings which had once held my trap in place were ripped from the ceiling, a chunk of plaster coming down with them. The whole room shook, and I could see Sarah on the other side of Eli leaping back as his arms smashed down where she'd been standing moments before. She aimed her taser at him and pulled the trigger, firing 2 darts into his chest. A moment later, she triggered an electric shock through them, which made him stumble backwards but not fall to the ground. Lucas shot his tranquilizer darts but missed. The creature turned its attention to Lucas then, backhanding him across the face hard enough to send him sprawling across the floor like a rag doll. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from one nearby wall and pulled back on its safety pin. As soon as Eli started advancing toward Sarah again, who was still trying to reload her taser gun while he approached, I let go. A blast of snowy chemical foam filled up half our ranger station, covering everything within seconds, including both Sarah and myself, but mostly the creature, which was now advancing towards us with blind fury in its eyes. The room filled with the hiss of the extinguisher's spray, and I could hear a roar of anger from within the clouded white mess as it made contact with its eyes. Sarah had been smart enough to get out of the way when she saw what I was doing, ducking down beneath her desk and covering her head as if expecting a tornado to come through at any moment. And now she emerged from her hiding place coughing and sputtering, but otherwise okay. The chaos was punctuated by one other sound, the blaring of our station's alarm system, which had been triggered by Sarah during all this struggle. The high-pitched wail added to my already pounding headache as we regrouped, trying to fend off Eli or whatever he was now, who seemed disoriented but still dangerous nonetheless. Then suddenly the entity had taken on the appearance of Lucas, and was no longer being subtle about its intentions. It swung at me with a forceful punch, trying to catch me off guard as I scrambled to get up from the floor. "Mike, what are you doing?" It shouted in Lucas's voice, which now sounded like a distorted imitation of my colleague rather than an exact copy. "You're going to kill him." Meanwhile, the real Lucas, identifiable by a distinguishable tear in his shirt sleeve, grappled with the entity from behind. He had one arm around its neck and was trying to apply a chokehold. The thing laughed at him through Lucas's imitation, but it came out distorted and wrong. Sarah was several paces away from us both, and she seemed unsure who to help first as we struggled with our respective opponents. The entity must have sensed her hesitation, because suddenly it shifted again into another replica of me, creating 2 mirror images side by side, which would be difficult for her to differentiate between. "Shoot them both," I yelled at Sarah when she didn't immediately respond. "One of them is going down." She hesitated for only another moment before deciding on one of us and pulling her gun free from her holster. The entity took advantage of her momentary lapse, though, launching itself at Sarah. It tackled her hard enough that they both went crashing into one wall before rebounding off it like pinballs into another wall across the room. I rolled under a haymaker punch, aimed at my head and retrieved something useful from a top 1 bookshelf. A flare gun I kept handy for emergencies like these when you needed some extra light or wanted to start a signal fire. I ignited the flare with a swift flick of my thumb, turning it into a bright red torch. The room was instantly bathed in hellish light, and I thrust the thing at Lucas's face or whatever it was that looked like him. The entity recoiled from the heat of the flare, part of its false skin bubbling and melting off as if it had been made from wax. It staggered back, losing shape again as it tried to find another form to mimic. Its voice changed once more as well, this time becoming Sarah's voice in all its perfect imitation. "Please stop, I can't take any more." Lucas was panting and sweat-drenched on his hands and knees nearby, having been thrown by the entity's charge. He picked up his baton from where he dropped it during our struggle, and took another step closer to us both, unsure who to believe now. "Don't listen," I said through gritted teeth as I fought against my own urge to trust in what we were seeing before us. It can mimic voices perfectly, but not everything else. Look at how erratic its movements are, and listen carefully for slip-ups. They're subtle, but they're there. Sarah emerged from her hiding place behind one desk with a fire extinguisher in hand this time instead of her gun. She stood several paces away from me and Lucas, spraying down whoever she thought might be real. Or maybe just trying to put out fires caused by my flare gun, which had caught some papers on fire. The white cloud enveloped both me and Lucas for several seconds before she realized her mistake and adjusted her aim slightly so that only one person was being sprayed with foam now. The thing that looked like me, but almost certainly wasn't. Lucas recognized Sarah's mistake too, when he saw how much longer the entity was able to stand than I was. He swung his baton at its knees, taking it off its feet. I leapt on top of it immediately, pinning it down with my body weight. We struggled back and forth like two animals fighting over territory in the wild. The struggle was raw and frenzied as I pressed the flare close to its shifting face, causing it to shriek and thrash beneath me. Then suddenly, with a surge of strength that felt impossible for something that size, the thing pushed me off and sent me flying across the room. It got up onto all fours before standing on two legs again, looking more like a man now than anything else. The creature made a break for the door, but we were ready this time. Lucas moved in from one side while Sarah came at it from another with her fire extinguisher still spraying foam everywhere like she was putting out an inferno. The thing began cycling through appearances again, showing us different faces of other rangers we'd worked with before, as well as hikers who had gone missing in these woods over the years. Its shape destabilized further, as if panicking now that there was no way out. Lucas and Sarah cornered it against one wall while I came at it from another side. My gun drawn this time instead of just swinging fists or trying to stab it with pens or pencils, which were all useless against this thing. It screamed at us then, each voice coming out distorted through its shifting mouth, until finally they blended together into an unrecognizable sound, which seemed more animal than human. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, all those faces vanished into thin air as the creature turned around and leaped through one of the windows. In the immediate aftermath, I paced back and forth, the adrenaline from the fight yielding to a sparking rush of strategic thought, running my hands through my hair. Several plans formulated and were discarded in a span of seconds. Lucas and Sarah watched with vigilant eyes, their postures tensed like coiled springs, ready for my cue. Stopping mid-step, I met their gaze squarely. "I have an idea," I said. My voice quivered, but grew stronger with each word, as I outlined a high-stakes plan to lead the entity away from the safety of our ranger station and into the forest where it was originally found. Lucas sifted through a nearby drawer, procuring lengths of rope and hooks, tools that might aid us in our new endeavor. Sarah grabbed a walkie-talkie from her desk drawer as well. She clipped it to her belt, along with her radio handset, which was already attached there by default when we were on duty. I grabbed my jacket that was stuffed with emergency supplies that might be needed in case we got lost or injured out there in the unpredictable wilderness. The tension in the air twisted like an invisible whirlwind around us as we prepared for what lay ahead. We tightened our boots one last time before heading out into night's embrace again. Calibrating flashlights while standing at opposite ends of our workspace, we clicked them on simultaneously once they were set to maximum brightness. The ranger station's isolation had once been seen as an advantage, a buffer against the world where we could determine who came in or went out based on footprints left behind by hikers or hunters coming through this territory. Now it had become something else entirely, a tactical disadvantage which meant nothing more than another obstacle for us to escape from if things went south tonight. The three of us understood that what lay ahead would test our fortitude in ways we never imagined. The thing's elusiveness hung over us like an oppressive fog, but at least now we had a plan, a way to fight back. Lucas, Sarah, and I prepared to step into the dark once more, knowing the creature may be watching us from its unseen vantage point, waiting for us to run again so it could chase after us. But this time, we hoped to turn the misdirection around on it. Exiting the ranger station, we split up to search for the creature. I went back to the trail where I'd found Eli, looking for signs of its passing. There were broken branches, and snapped saplings dotted my surroundings, indicating something large had passed through this way in a hurry. I kept my eyes on the ground as I walked along, scanning for footprints or other clues as to its whereabouts. But there was nothing, until I saw something out of place just ahead of me on the trail, a flattened bush. I bent down to check it out and looked around again, scanning my surroundings. Suddenly there was movement up ahead, and I saw something moving between two trees just off the path. "God damn it," I shouted, breaking into a sprint after it once more. After pursuing the thing through the forest, I stopped, facing the thing with unwavering determination. Both of us stood mere feet apart on rocky ground that led to a sheer cliff edge. The gap between us crackled with tension. Our final standoff had arrived. The entity roared with an inhuman fury that echoed through the tall pines. My heart pounded against my chest, but my training reigned supreme over fear. I recalled every detail of the Ranger manual, though none covered this kind of confrontation. Gripping a sturdy branch I had grabbed earlier, a makeshift weapon to level the playing field, I watched as it lunged at me again, attempting to overpower me with its unnatural strength. But I sidestepped its assault and swung my branch like a baseball bat as hard as I could. The branch connected with it, and for a moment it felt like an ephemeral victory until I saw what was left in my hands. A few splinters from where it had made contact before breaking into pieces. Undeterred by this setback, I ducked and weaved through another flurry of strikes from it, whatever it was, managing to maintain distance between us despite being backed up against a sheer cliff face now. The rapid dance of survival played out against the backdrop of rising sun that began to spill golden light across the wild landscape around us. I stamped on the ground beneath me, searching for footing solid enough to withstand our confrontation without giving way beneath one or both of us. It attacked again and again, claws swiping wildly at my face or neck, but each time narrowly missing by inches, as if guided by some unseen force, which kept me safe from harm, while also prolonging our fight, so we could wear each other down further before reaching whatever inevitable conclusion awaited us here. Finally, there came an opening when one swipe went wide and missed entirely, and then another, and another. The thing's screeches mingled with the rush of the wind as it grew more and more frantic, searching for an opening to take me down. But I was ready. I knew my chance would come eventually. And when it did, I had to be ready to seize it swiftly and decisively. At last, the claws came at me again, swiping left, then right, then left again in a series of complex movements that were difficult to predict or avoid. But I managed to duck under one swipe, which was aimed for my face, so close that it ruffled my hair as it went by, and then leaned back as another swipe came from below. I felt its claws pass just inches in front of my face, but managed not only to avoid them, but also counter with a precise, calculated push. My hands planted on its torso like a linebacker making a tackle in football, channeling every ounce of energy into the thrust. It lost balance instantly and began teetering backward like a child, learning how to walk on 2 feet for the first time. Rocks dislodged beneath its feet as we both went stumbling backward step by step until we were no longer on solid ground at all. And then, there was nothing but empty air behind us, where there should have been earth beneath our feet. With one final exertion, I shoved against it with all the strength born of fear, desperation, and the instinct to protect myself from harm. Its eyes widened in surprise as it teetered on the edge of oblivion momentarily, before grasping at empty air, where there should have been something solid beneath its fingers. Then came a screech, which faded into silence after only a few moments. I rushed forward immediately after this happened, so there would be no chance for escape if somehow this thing still lived. But when I peered down into that chasm, which swallowed any hint of what lay within its depths, there was nothing but darkness. The forest canopy stretched out below us, undisturbed by the thing's passage through its depths. I listened intently, hands braced on my knees as I tried to catch my breath. No sound emerged from the gulf below. No movement, only the soft whisper of the leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant calls of morning birds. My muscles relaxed after a few moments like they always do once a threat has passed, signaling to me that it's finally over and I can breathe again. The danger is gone, dispatched into the unknown void below us. Yet still my gaze lingers on that abyss for a moment longer before turning away. A silent farewell to whatever this thing was, which had tested me so thoroughly and pushed me closer to my limits than any other encounter ever had before. Turning away from it at last, I took in a deep breath of crisp forest air. The immediate danger has passed, but still there is something lingering in these woods, a feeling that tells me this will not be our last encounter with something strange or dangerous out here. With heavy but steady gait, I began making my way back toward home base again. The morning was beautiful and serene around me, as if nothing had happened at all. But inside, I knew better than anyone else just how close we'd come to disaster today. How close we'd come to becoming another statistic on some forgotten page in an old ranger's logbook somewhere. The forest is never quite what it seems. That much is clear now more than ever before. I approached the ranger station at dawn, the light from the rising sun painting the sky with a palette of warm colors. Through a window, I saw that Sarah was shaking occasionally with residual tremors from her fear, despite being inside and wrapped in a fleece blanket. She stood up when she saw me coming, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance. Lucas was standing close to one of the windows, his hands cupped around his eyes to peer out into the emerging daylight. The door opened with my push, a creak betraying the silence of this early hour. Sarah turned to face me as I entered, her blanket clenched in one hand, and her eyes widening even more upon seeing me up close. Lucas pivoted away from looking outside and came towards me instead. The expression on his face softened as he saw that I had returned safely. "Thank God," he said softly under his breath before striding over to assist me. His arm reached out under mine and provided support for most of my weight. As I took a seat at one of our workstations, an elevated surface covered in maps where we could study them or lay them out for others to see what we were working on. My knees buckled slightly as I went down into it, but Lucas held on to me firmly so that I wouldn't fall all the way down onto it or hit anything else nearby. My body collapsed into the chair with an exhausted sigh after he let go and sat back down himself across from us both. Sarah's strides were quick over to where we kept our first aid supplies, shelves full of bandages and medical tape, along with disinfectant spray bottles filled with rubbing alcohol or iodine solution for cleaning wounds. She retrieved the green plastic box labeled first aid and came back over to my side. Lucas leaned down and looked at my side where I had been hit by the creature. I winced as he pressed down on it with his fingers, checking for any internal bleeding or other injuries that might have been caused by the encounter. Sarah returned to my side after a moment, opening up a bottle of disinfectant and spraying it onto a cotton pad. She began cleaning off the blood from my brow where it was starting to crust over. Sarah focused on her task despite her shaking hands, trying not to hurt me further in her efforts. Lucas's expression was one of concentration as he secured a fresh bandage around my side once he'd finished examining me. He pressed down firmly with his hands afterwards to make sure there wasn't any lingering bleeding coming from beneath it. Light from the emerging dawn filtered through the windows now, cutting across all of the cabinetry and worktops. Sarah and Lucas exchanged glances of understanding despite exhaustion's pull after such an experience. Relief resonated in their shared looks at seeing me again alive and well. Lucas offered me a nod, then looked at Sarah beside him, doing her best impression of someone who hadn't just seen something impossible happen right before their eyes. Something that should have been impossible according to everything they knew about science or nature or reality itself. Sarah took that opportunity to look away from him finally too, looking instead at some maps tacked up on another wall nearby, which showed various parts of our territory, trails winding through mountains covered in evergreen trees, lakes and rivers and the occasional road or small settlement. As morning's light grew stronger, washing the room in its gentle golden hue, I took small sips from the canteen Sarah had handed over to me. She found support against the station's sturdy wall then, her body sliding down it until she was sitting on the floor. The sign of her exhaustion was apparent as she exhaled a long breath and closed her eyes. Lucas made his rounds along our interior perimeter after that, checking to make sure everything was still secure in here. Lucas went to check on our radio equipment next, making sure it hadn't been damaged during our encounter with whatever it was that had attacked us yesterday. I'd already done my own inspection of all that stuff when I first came inside, but he wanted to be thorough about things, so I didn't tell him not to bother. He came back over after a moment, having confirmed everything looked fine. "Do you think we should call this in?" he asked Sarah, then looked at me for my opinion too. "Maybe they'll send out some other rangers or something." I shook my head slowly at that suggestion, though, thinking about it before answering him right away like he seemed to want me to do. Sarah stood beside me, holding a pen and a standard incident report form. She looked at me, then down at the form, waiting for me to speak. Lucas was checking the locks on the station's doors and windows now, making sure everything was still secure in here. He shifted his attention towards us after a moment of silence with his back to us, walking over with heavy steps that made faint impressions on the wooden floor, which echoed slightly in the quiet room. "All right," I said finally, taking a deep breath before beginning. "Here's what we're going to say happened." My voice slowed as I began reciting from memory. Composing this false report weighed heavily on my conscience, but there was no other option available to us. We couldn't tell anyone what had really happened out here because nobody would believe it. "We were tracking an animal when we came across some strange footprints," I said slowly. "They were large, bigger than anything I've ever seen before." I went on from there, telling her about how we'd followed these tracks for hours until they disappeared into thin air. Whatever it was must have heard or smelled us coming. Sarah added when she saw me struggling for words again. I nodded gratefully at her help as she continued writing down my statements on the incident form. Her handwriting was meticulous as always, Sarah's attention to detail ensuring our fabricated tale would appear as an official and truthful account of events. If anyone ever read it later on, she knew how important this story would be if anyone ever reviewed our case file, which they almost certainly wouldn't unless something else strange happened around here in future, which could be linked back to this incident somehow. Sarah grimaced slightly as she wrote certain parts of my statement down but didn't say anything about it. She knew this was necessary, even if she didn't like it. Lucas listened intently as I spoke, interjecting occasionally to add plausible details, or to suggest slight alterations that would make the story more convincing to any outside party reviewing our case. His suggestions were logical and made sense in the context of what we'd experienced, painting a picture of a believable scenario which would justify our recent hasty actions and heightened state of alert. When we finished writing out the incident report, Sarah handed it over for me to sign at the bottom. I hesitated for a moment before accepting the document from her, looking down at my signature on the page with my heart pounding in my chest. The pen shook slightly as I signed my name, but not enough that anyone else would notice unless they were really looking closely. My hand was steady enough that everything came out neat and legible, just like an official form should be. Sarah gathered up all of the required paperwork after that, so she could file away this report with all the others we'd ever filled out during our time working together as rangers here in these woods. The weight of our falsehood settled around us like a tangible presence within these walls as she did so, making its presence known even though nobody had said anything about what had happened since coming back inside yesterday afternoon. Lucas walked back over towards where he'd been checking locks again after peering outside through one of those glass panes beside each door, which allowed you to see who was standing on your porch, without having to open it up first and let them inside if you didn't want them there with you right away for some reason. His expression was less certain now than when he'd come back in from his rounds outside earlier on today. A mix of relief and unease, tinging his typical resolve now that he knew what had really happened out there yesterday afternoon, wasn't something which occurred every day around here. As Lucas returned to the central area of the station, Sarah and I shared a fleeting look of silent understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of necessity laced with a touch of regret. We both knew why we had to lie about what happened out there, how important it was to maintain the facade of normalcy for the outside world. But at the same time, we couldn't ignore what we'd seen and experienced. It was burned into our memories now like a brand on our souls, something which could never be forgotten or ignored again, no matter how much we might want it to be otherwise. The incident report was placed into a cabinet drawer. The cabinet clicked shut after that, and everything went quiet in here once. The next day, armed with a flashlight, I stalked through the forest with an air of watchfulness. Fresh from the encounters of the day, my mind swirled with a sense of unease about the wilderness surrounding me. Passing the gnarled branches of trees, I stopped, scanned the environment. The flashlight illuminated a circle of visibility within the pressing dark, casting elongated shadows that twisted and played tricks on my mind. My grip on the flashlight tightened, a sliver of sweat beating on my brow despite the cool night air. I listened closely to the forest sounds, discerning what was natural from what might be something else, if there was indeed any difference at all between those two categories in this place. Continuing along our patrol route, ingrained through countless nights like these, I remained observant for anything amiss, anything that would seem out of place amid this nocturnal stillness. The murmur of a breeze through leaves, a movement which might have been some nocturnal animal or other, all kept me on edge as we moved further into our patrol area. Despite putting forth an unshakable facade most days, one which conveyed confidence and composure in any situation, there were times when even someone who has spent years doing this job can't help but feel uncertain about what they're up against out here in these woods. And while it's important not to let those fears get to you too much, or you'd never be able to do your job, it's also important not to ignore them completely either. As we moved deeper into our patrol area that night, those feelings came back again, stronger than ever after everything we'd seen yesterday. But this time it wasn't just the forest I was worried about, it was the people out there too. The ones who come here to visit and hike and camp. I shivered involuntarily as a cold breeze blew through the trees overhead. The sound of distant laughter carried on that wind for a moment before being snuffed out by the darkness once more. As I moved further into my patrol area, I couldn't help but feel like maybe I was being watched. Eventually, I emerged into a clearing. Here the moon bathed everything in its silvery glow, casting a celestial shimmer on everything from dew-laden grass to tree trunks and rocks alike. Deactivating my flashlight, I allowed its natural luminescence to take center stage instead. I paused for a moment in that place, taking a breath and allowing my eyes to roam across the heavens above us all, which seemed so much closer here than they did at home in civilization. Yet as restorative as this might be, I knew it was only a brief break in the narrative of a place where things could so readily slip from normal into something else entirely. The night continued on, peaceful now, but always watchful and waiting for something.